So I just really wanted to start by saying that the Imperial War Museum was actually one of the very first film archives in the country, so it does have a very, very good collection of contemporary material. And we've got 3 short films to see today, one of which is a contemporary piece, but 2 of them are from the IWM Short Film Festival, and they were films which were submitted last year. I'll say a little bit about each of them when I introduce them. So it strikes me that it's quite typical that we've got some very old contemporary material, and then we've got some very new material which is based on the collections and using the subject of the First World War. So film was very popular during the First World War. In 1916, weekly audience attendance was 20 million in Britain, but it was actually regarded as being a very kind of lowbrow type of entertainment. It was very much for the working class, until the government realised that actually it had enormous reach and it could be very valuable for recruitment purposes. So the first film that we're going to see is called War Women of England, and it has the IWM number 474. And I did also want to say that we have just recently relaunched a film site at IWM. So if you are interested in watching contemporary footage, the website address is film.iwmcollections.org.uk. And although it is primarily geared towards commercial customers, you can actually watch the films free of charge, and you can see them properly. It's just if you try and download them, you'll find they're all marked because obviously you're supposed to pay to license them. But it is a very, very useful resource, and I would urge you to have a look at it. So the first film that we're going to see, as I say, is War Women of England, and this is filmed between 1917 and 1918, and there are 3 different scenes within it. So we're going to see members of the Women's Land Army. It's a recruitment march in central London in 1917, and you can see just how effective this must have been. You know, if you're sitting in the dark with everybody else and wondering whether you can do your bit for the war effort, you might actually think about joining the Women's Land Army and helping to feed the country, because agriculture was very important, especially with submarine warfare going on and difficulty with importing. We've also got footage of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and I mentioned them earlier on this morning because from March 1917, that's when they were established, and they were serving over on the Western Front, and we can see some of their activities there. The intertitles are, which is what we call the little frame where it gives you the words, are very interesting. It says, where are we? For men must fight and women must work, which is quite interesting. And then we see the foundation of the Women's Parliamentary Party, and this is women from the Women's Social and Political Union on the 7th of November 1917 outside the Queen's Hall in London. And you can see from left to right when they come on the screen Christabel Pankhurst, her mother Emmeline, General Flora Drummond and Annie Kenney. So I think it's quite extraordinary seeing photographs come to life like that. And one of the things I would say actually, but we find it quite hard to think about today, is just how prevalent uniforms would be on the streets, looking at the women clothed in their different uniforms. Now, the next film that we're going to see is called Deeds, Not Words. And that is about the Endell Street Hospital, which we did see a wonderful painting of that when I spoke this morning. They designed their own uniforms as well, and I often think it must have been enormous fun trying to come up with a uniform that you're going to wear. You know, you want it to look, it's got to look quite military, it's got to look quite masculine, but you want to feminise it as well. And I think when you're looking at photographs of uniforms, it might be interesting to look at them in that way in the future. So the next two films were submissions for the IWM Short Film Festival. And I'm just going to give you a description of what that is. It's a showcase of imaginative and challenging films inspired by our collections and our role to explore the causes, course and consequences of war and conflict and its impact on people's lives. So 681 films were submitted last year, 37 of which were shortlisted. And the one we're going to see first actually won Best Use of IWM Archive category. It was made by Alison Ramsey, and as I say, it's about the hospital in Endell Street, which was staffed entirely by women. So we saw the Women's Parliamentary Party, which was a women's social and political union organisation. The women who ran this hospital in Endell Street were very much suffragettes. They were also WSPU women. And it was staffed entirely by women, right down from anaesthetists, doctors, surgeons, right down to orderlies, and was actually quite a unique organisation, really. The other interesting thing that I want to tell you, it was set up in the Endell Street workhouse, and we've heard quite a bit this morning about how workhouses were used for military hospitals. This one is reputed to be the one that Oliver Twist, the workhouse scene, is modelled on, because Charles Dickens lived just sort of round the corner from it, as it were.
In the early 1900s, Emmeline Pankhurst founded the Women's Social and Political Union as part of the campaign to give women the vote. The group's members, better known as suffragettes, used militant tactics, campaigning under the banner, Deeds, Not Words. Two prominent suffragettes who fought for equal rights were doctors Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson.
Murray had acted as personal honorary physician to the militant organisation, so that when suffragettes were injured in scuffles, she would provide first aid. She treated hunger strikers after their release from prison. And she also very bravely carried out a vociferous campaign against the effects of forcible feeding and survived attempts by the Home Office to discredit her. Her friend and colleague, Dr. Louisa Garrett Anderson, was also a member of Mrs. Pankhurst's organisation, having been frustrated by the fact that the more moderate wing of the party was failing to get anywhere. She too, like Flora Murray, she spoke at meetings, she marched in processions, but in March 1912 she took the unusual step, unusual for a doctor, of throwing a brick through the window of a cabinet minister who had made an anti-suffrage speech, and for that she was sentenced to 6 weeks hard labour in Holloway. For a woman doctor, if they were seen to be active, it could actually threaten the rather precarious status of women in medicine.
At the outbreak of war in August 1914, suffragettes who'd been fighting for the right to vote suspended their militant campaign and devoted themselves to the war effort.
Murray and Anderson were quite clear that they could contribute to the medical services for the troops and should. They didn't go to the War Office and offer their services because they knew from their experiences in the suffrage movement that they'd be told to go home and knit socks or something. So they went to the French embassy.
Anderson and Murray quickly gathered a small group of women doctors, nurses and orderlies and set up a makeshift hospital at the Hotel Claridge in Paris. Their newly formed Women's Hospital Corps treated a constant stream of wounded troops over the next 6 months. By early 1915, the War Office started to set up new hospitals in England.
Murray and Anderson offered to go back and work in a hospital in England, and they were invited to meet the Director General of the Royal Army Medical Corps, Sir Alfred Keogh, who happened to be a supporter of women in medicine. And he, to their amazement, offered them the chance to run one of the new war hospitals. This was an extraordinary offer. Suddenly they were being acknowledged as capable of doing this. Murray and Anderson, of course, realised that it would give them the opportunity to show very publicly that professional women, medical women, could do the job as well as their male colleagues. So they seized the chance and rushed back to London.
The doctors were taken to a large Victorian workhouse on Endell Street, Covent Garden, which was undergoing rapid renovation work to transform it into the first British military hospital to be run by women.
Murray and Anderson were taken round the buildings that were to become the Endell Street Hospital in March 1915, and their guide was the colonel in charge of the renovations for the army. The colonel himself was absolutely appalled at the thought of women taking over his hospital, and he spent his time taking them round exclaiming, "Good God, women!" The officials in the War Office were convinced that the hospital wouldn't last more than 6 months. In the event, it lasted 4.5 years.
Murray and Anderson rapidly assembled a large staff of women, many of whom had been their colleagues in the suffragette movement before the war. And the Endell Street Military Hospital welcomed its first patients in May 1915.
There was a staff of about 180, 33 doctors, most of whom were just visiting consultants, but there were a number of junior doctors who lived in or close by. There were about 30 trained nurses. These were sisters. Most of the nursing was done by orderlies, nursing orderlies, and there were about 80 of those, mostly young girls. And then there were orderlies in the laundry, in the kitchen and so on. And then there were cooks, cleaners, quartermaster, transport officer, all women.
Two of the young women who volunteered to work at Endell Street were teenage sisters, Barbara and Nina Last.
My very beloved grandmother, who I still think of, although she died in 1973, was Nina Last. And her sister, her younger sister, was Barbara Last. Barbara was a born nurse, my great-aunt, and she signed up when the hospital opened. And she was only 17, and she was considered good by Dr. Flora Murray and Dr. Anderson, and they accepted her to be a nursing orderly. When my grandmother Nina arrived, she was given jobs that had been done by male orderlies, and that was really, I think, quite taxing. She was very tiny in stature, and she had to sort of take huge bins of sort of awful severed limbs and dirty dressings around the place and put them into incinerators and other places, and it was very, very hard physical work. When convoys came in, which was often about midnight, they'd get up and put clothes on over their night dresses, put caps on over their pigtails, and go down into the courtyard and have to take out the men on the stretchers. And the stretchers' handles were huge, meant for men's hands, and my grandma's hands are very, very tiny. And so it was quite hard. I don't think she dusted a room, boiled an egg, or done any housework or anything like that before the war. And suddenly to be confronted with doing very heavy manual work must have been quite overwhelming, and I think she was overwhelmed. My grandmother wrote, "Forgetfulness of oneself was all." And they did. They just decided to forget themselves completely and devote themselves to helping the men. The military hospital, September the 8th, 1918. My darling mother. This place is an absolute hell. It is simply crammed with frightful cases, and convoys keep on coming in every night. I've had a tremendous week of it, and on Wednesday I had to go through over 500 sheets alone, not to speak of everything else. My idea of hell is always changing. It is now the dirty wash, which is unspeakably awful. Besides the smell and dirt, nearly all the bundles are full of vermin, and there is so much of it we can't forbear groaning aloud in agony. Nothing could prepare them for the carnage and the misery, the hell actually, what they met, people coming straight from the front. Dr. Louisa Anderson and Dr. Flora Murray told my grandmother that with the right kind of girl, they could do anything. The girls could do anything. They believed in the women.
I think because Endell Street was so near the main railway stations, it was inevitable that they received quite a high proportion of very severely injured patients. Well, when a convoy arrived, the bell sounded in the courtyard and everybody descended, the doctors and the stretcher bearers, everybody who was involved in reception of the convoy. And then these ambulances would come in. The women would lift the patients from the ambulances, which again was unheard of before. It wasn't thought suitable for women to be stretcher bearers. And then one of the senior doctors, Flora Murray or Louisa Garrett Anderson, would triage the patients and work out where they should go and what should happen to them. And then they'd be carried off by the orderlies to the wards or to the theatre. Murray and Anderson very much led by example. They worked themselves to the bone. Women joined them from all over, and most of them had had very little clinical experience. That was a fact for women doctors, unless they were lucky enough when they qualified to get a job at a woman-run hospital. It was almost impossible for them to practice after qualifying. Women doctors saw women and children. They didn't ever treat men, or virtually never treated men before the First World War.
In spring 1917, 28-year-old Dr. Vera Scantlebury travelled 10,000 miles from her home in Melbourne, Australia, for the chance to work with the women of Endell Street.
I am not at all keen on military surgery. I did some operations in the afternoon, 2 amputations, an infection of the pleuritic cavity, a very sick boy, and the other, a fracture of the arm in which the nerve was found divided and it needed suturing. I cannot bring before you a vivid picture of that beehive of an operating theatre, with its hot, stifling atmosphere and white-gowned and hooded women moving ceaselessly about, and the sweet, heavy, sickly fumes of the chloroform.
Having been met with initial hostility, the suffragette hospital soon became widely known and admired. In 1917, Murray and Anderson each received the CBE in recognition of their many achievements, which included the treatment of over 26,000 patients, 7,000 medical operations, and the first hospital-based clinical research papers to be published by women doctors in The Lancet.
I think their story is very inspiring, and I think as a woman doctor myself, I'm aware that they did a huge amount to overcome prejudice against women in medicine. The reason they had taken the hospital was to show that women could do the job as well as men, and therefore were equal citizens and had the right to the vote. They had, of course, shown very publicly what women could do. They had proved that they could run a hospital, that they could treat severely injured casualties, and that they could cope with complex medical and surgical problems. And they'd done all this without the world ending. The hospital took the motto of the suffragettes, which was deeds, not words, that your actions speak louder than your words. It's fair to say that despite the fact that the suffrage campaigns had stopped at the start of the war, campaigning was going on strongly in a British Army hospital.
So moving on to the final selection for this afternoon. This is another submission for the IWM Short Film Festival. This one is, it's called The Invisible Killer of World War I, Blast Injury. And basically it's about the physiological impact of a shockwave and how, just being wounded isn't the sort of full story. And it talks about the discoveries which were made by a female scientist which still have a relevance today. And just before I set that off, I just wanted to say that if anybody has been inspired to submit their own film to the IWM Short Film Festival, the deadline is April the 27th, and actually there is quite a high standard to live up to, I think. So here goes the last submission this afternoon.
Paris, 1917. A neuroscientist, Augusta Desjardins Klumpke, arrived for work. A wind from the east carried the sound of artillery and gunfire up and down the front, a reminder that the world was at war and was likely to be so for some time. Her work was at a hospital ward for injured soldiers, although she wasn't there as a doctor, but as an investigator, so really it was a laboratory. Everyone in the rows of beds had lost limbs in the fighting. Initially, their injury was dealt with effectively by well-practiced surgeons and medical staff. Infections were managed as well as anyone knew how, and the men were fitted with new limbs, made to fit their stumps properly by trained prosthetic builders. For the first few months of their new lives, everything had gone to plan. They had learned to walk again and had returned home to their families. But none expected what came next. Their stumps swelled and reddened. Manageable pain became unbearable, and their new limbs simply wouldn't fit anymore. It was as if none of the careful work of the surgeons and the nurses had mattered. The patients were back in clumsy wheelchairs, crippled and useless. No one could understand why. Doctor after doctor handled their stumps, prodded and poked them, and then stood back in puzzled silence. There was no infection, no nerve damage, no reason why their restoration should be failing so completely. Yet the evidence was there in bed after bed. In the final year of the war, the neuroscientist Augusta made a breakthrough. She'd been taking X-rays of the failing stumps, one of the first uses of X-rays in medical research, and had noticed that what had once been neatly healing bone ends were now jagged and rough. It wasn't the bones themselves that had grown over, it was the tissue surrounding the bone, nerves, blood vessels, and especially muscles. What had once been soft tissue was becoming hard tissue, becoming bone itself. This new hard tissue affected the nerves and the stump, causing it to swell and become painful, destroying the neat profile that had been used for the prosthetic fit. Augusta noticed something else. All the soldiers had been injured in the same way. They'd not been injured by gunfire, or stabbed, they'd all been brought down by the powerful blast of a heavy shell fired from a large artillery weapon. From the story told on her X-rays, Augusta theorised that it was not only the metal fragments and shrapnel that had injured the men. The actual blast wave energy of the explosion had also somehow affected them, and was still affecting them long after their original injuries had healed. But then, in 1918, the Great War ended. Augusta's ward was closed down, and the men dispersed to hospitals across France. Augusta kept up her research as best she could, but without the war it lacked focus and support, so eventually she returned to her civilian research. She died in 1927, and her results, conclusions, and her patient subjects faded away to live lives much impaired by the failure to resolve their condition. Almost a century later, in another war where soldiers lost their limbs to high explosive munitions in mines and improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, medics began to notice that amputation stumps were not healing as they should. Expensive custom-made prosthetics stopped fitting after months or a year's worth of normal use, and stumps became malformed due to pain and swelling. Again, scans revealed inexplicable bony growth along nerve shafts or blood vessels or in muscle mass. It wasn't the bones themselves, but the soft tissue around the bones turning hard. There is a name for this now: heterotopic ossification, or HO. It is experienced by almost 70% of military amputees whose limbs were lost as a result of blast injury.
Where one scientist led a century ago, others now follow, seeking to understand the full range of physical consequences of an invisible killer, the blast effects of a high explosive shock wave. While HO is experienced months or even years after the original explosion, the shock wave strikes within milliseconds, surging through the human being, wreaking havoc.
Blast injury is where physics meets human biology. Explosions generate very fast, very powerful increases in air pressure, transferred as a wave outwards and away from the site of the blast. The shockwave passes through the tissues, causing differences in pressure at all sites in the body where gas and liquid are contained. Bowels can rupture, with resulting bleeding or peritonitis requiring complex treatment. Eardrums are also ruptured, and though most hearing injuries resolve themselves spontaneously, some do not, leaving the casualty with a permanent impairment from tinnitus to deafness. Most serious of all is the effect on the lungs. Lungs are composed almost entirely of air, bound by the thinnest of membranes, which allows oxygen into the blood. The shockwave tears into this most fragile of tissues and lays it to waste, causing swelling and hemorrhage.
This injury, called blast lung, is inflicted even by moderate shock waves, which don't otherwise cause significant damage. It's particularly dangerous because the damage doesn't stop once the wave has passed through. Instead, it gets progressively worse, asymptomatically until it's too late.
Initially, if a patient presented with a burst eardrum, then blast lung was assumed. Now all patients likely to have been exposed to a shockwave, whatever its force, are scanned for blast lung and treated for blood loss, and with oxygen therapy to restore lung tissue. Organ by organ, researchers are consolidating our understanding of what happens as the blast wave travels through our bodies. The immediate effects are understood, but conditions such as heterotopic ossification, HO, give clear indications that long-term effects are also initiated at the moment of wave impact. These are complicated and difficult to treat, and researching them requires a multidisciplinary team of scientists and clinicians. A consensus is appearing. Shockwaves may trigger or distort the body's own inflammatory response, altering it at the genetic level. This appears to be the explanation for what happens in the formation of HO. One possible way to mitigate the effects of blast injury is an early intervention at the genetic level to restore or normalise the inflammatory response mechanism. However, perhaps the most serious threat to blast injury casualties is our inability to consolidate research gains made during wartime. Medical history shows that we are always efficient at treating the immediate emergencies of wounds, but have not been able to sustain work to resolve the broader issues, like pain in its various forms and head injury, that we now call traumatic brain injury. Imagine if the 1917 research had been formalised into a research programme that had run consistently for a century. It isn't hard to imagine that our understanding of cellular biology, of pain, and of bioengineering would have been considerably further advanced than it is now. Just because we no longer hear the sound of artillery or mines exploding doesn't mean we should forget what happens when they do.
I think that is a really fitting place to finish, actually. It's quite, what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, thinking about, we've seen some footage of contemporary First World War material, seeing women working and recruiting activities for women. We then moved on to look at a hospital which women were instrumental in running, and it was inspirational film footage, I think, looking at that. It was quite a unique organisation. And then we finished by looking at, I suppose, lessons not learned. I mean, I think this is a great thing that we do. One of the good things about war is that it's always a catalyst, I think, for development and learning about medical changes and improvements, things like blood transfusions, things like penicillin. But actually it's interesting to see that people still carry on fighting, and lessons are not always learned. So I think that last piece that we saw actually is a kind of interesting testament to that. So I hope that you agree that actually it's been an incredibly worthwhile day. I'm very grateful to PRONI for organising this, and I feel quite privileged to have been part of it. And I'm very glad that you've had the opportunity to see some of the IWM film footage as well.